some people might actually think of like, well, networking in general, it feels transactional. So
Yep.
can you detail a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. And my early models for this felt very used car salesman-y. So I at first thought I was horrible at networking when I realized networking is just getting to know people, right? Then it's like, oh, okay, I can do that. Like that sounds great. Helping people, getting to talk to them, getting to know their stories. I think approaching it less as a, oh, I need to make this sale or I need to get this thing. Like I wouldn't approach it that way. It also just feels icky. I don't know. Maybe some people like that. I'm definitely not one of them. But if you approach it as a, oh, how cool is it that I get to like learn about this person? And I would also say like as, I know people find it hard to believe, but as an introvert, I actually much more appreciate one-to-one interaction rather than large group unstructured settings. Getting to know people's story, what makes them tick, like how they got, essentially the questions you're asking me, right? The questions you ask other people, to get to know. And then sometimes there's an opportunity to collaborate, or problem solve together. Sometimes it's just oh, okay, like you're a cool person to know. And so I know when I meet someone that has that problem you're trying to solve, I'm gonna connect you. Or it's just a good conversation. And that's great. Like now you know somebody you didn't know before. I think if you approach the work with curiosity, I think it's more fun that way too.
All right. Thanks for joining us at the Life of a Career podcast, Lisa. Before we get started, can you give us a quick introduction of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Lisa Friscia. I've worn a lot of different hats, but currently I'm a talent strategy consultant, leadership coach, and also working to develop programs as the director of programs for an emerging EdTech startup called Ratio 21.
That's already sounds super interesting. Uh, was that what you always wanted to do when you were younger? Did
Oh
you
no.
even know that those careers existed?
No, definitely not. I think my parents told me when I was growing up I wanted to be a doctor and a hairdresser. I think that was what it was, age 5. And then over time, wanted to be a lawyer. And so that was the original plan. I'm from a largely first gen family. Everyone coming over from Italy, in the 50s, 60s, general time period. And so it was like a big thing. Like I was going to be a lawyer. So the pivot in college was a little bit challenging, but ultimately my family supported me as they do in anything I do.
When was the transition in deciding from medical to being a lawyer?
Yeah, well, that one's probably less so because I was 5. So I think the general idea was that I really liked helping and working with people. I wanted to be of help in some way, shape, or form. The lawyer piece came out just because I mean, part of it was I knew I didn't want to necessarily do, or at least 12-year-old Lisa didn't want to do things like big law or anything like that. I really thought about like civil rights legislation, Supreme Court law, like constitutional law, that sort of thing really energized me. I had done debate a bit in middle school and then pretty hardcore in high school, and loved crafting arguments and crafting, not because necessarily to argue, but I loved crafting like a thesis, right? In the same way that people like make a building, I loved crafting an argument. But yeah, things just shifted in college.
What caused the shift?
Yeah. So I think it started with where I went to college. So um, I originally decided to go to Amherst College, which was a very small liberal arts college, because it was just so different. I had been in this very high pressure testing high school in New York City that was very much about, you go and you're getting into the best college possible. It was a pretty high stress environment for teenagers, but that was where I was. And so I wanted to go to a place where just about learning and trying new things. And so in my mind, I knew I was going to come back to New York. I knew that I was going to be on this law track, but I wanted 4 years to just do something completely different. And did lots of different things. I was resident counselor. I played rugby. I had a year where I was a DJ on a radio station. Was very involved in campus community building, whether it was things around feminism or equity. I was a diversity educator. So was really big into building community and culture at the school. And somewhere along the line, and I loved doing those things. I loved just being able to activate different parts of my brain and was never bored. So then around junior year was when I was studying for my LSATs. And I didn't do as well as I was doing on the practice tests. And for someone who is, a struggling perfectionist and all of the things that come along with it, I was obviously incredibly upset. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, and I'll never forget, I was in the coffee shop with my friend Natalie and just saying, oh, I'm never going to get into a top law school. And she made the comment, Lisa, if you really wanted to be a lawyer, that wouldn't be your first response. And it made me think, why am I doing this? Like, why am I actually wanting to be a lawyer? Have I disconnected from it? And it's more about the achievement and not about actually the work that I would be doing. And so I came to the conclusion that I didn't know. And so I didn't make a decision in that moment. But what I said was, I'm not immediately going to go to law school. I'm going to take a year or two after college and do something totally different. I wasn't sure what that was going to be, but it was just open. And so I applied for Teach for America like a lot of people do. But actually I was with my sister taking the New York City subway. December, it was that winter break between, fall and spring semester. And there was a sign, and they used to have these subway signs for the New York City teaching fellows that were all like, you remember your fourth grade teacher who will remember your name. And they just really grabbed you. And there were a lot more that were even more sort of like kind of grabbed at your heartstrings. And so looked into it, and it was just a really great program. So I decided to apply to that and got into both programs, but decided to do the New York City Teaching Fellowship because it was in New York where my family was. Felt like there was a lot of new stuff happening. So I loved giving back to the New York City public school system because I grew up in it. And then they were also paying for my full master's. So that was a big draw. And so I was really fortunate to get placed in a new middle school in Queens. And while I didn't realize how much of a blessing that was for so many different reasons, I love Queens. I'm a Brooklyn girl, but Queens is one of the most diverse. It is the most diverse borough, one of the most diverse places, which is just an amazing place to be. And being in a new middle school, even though there were many, veteran teachers that were wonderful and wonderful to learn, there wasn't an entrenched, oh, this is the way we do things, because the school was totally new, which was a really great place to work because there was a lot of energy. There were a lot of new teachers. There was a lot of opportunity to get involved in prom and eighth grade activities and all these different things. So, yeah. And I loved my kids. I keep in touch with a lot of them over Facebook. But yeah, I really I fell in love with school because not just for learning, but for the community. And then fast forward a little bit, got into Teachers College and decided I wanted to pursue school leadership. So I'll pause there because I know it can go lots of different ways at this point.
Yeah, I'll kind of go a little bit backwards real quick,
Yeah.
just to see when you were deciding that, I'm going to take a couple of years off instead of going to law school, and then ultimately deciding to go get a master's in education, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there any like familial pressures like from family about that? Because they were, originally you were saying that this whole family was proud of you going to law school and all of these
Yeah.
things. Like, was there any of that?
No, and actually, all of the pressure was in my head, which I think is probably a theme I keep coming back to. I remember being really nervous about telling my mom because I was like, "Oh my God, she just paid for this LSAT course. Like, she's gonna kill me." I should have known this before I took the course. And she was great. She just said, first, like, I don't want you to do something you're miserable at. Two, I don't want to help you pay for something that you're going to drop out of. Like, that's not what we want to do. And the third thing, which I was the most struck by. She's like, I always thought you'd be a great teacher. That's like you used to play when you were little, at school and all those things. I think you could be really great at this. So yeah, they were super supportive.
That's great. I'm glad that they were supportive and it wasn't just like a
I
shock and and the family
mean, like,
turning.
I have to be honest, like if I was like, I'm gonna take a gap year and travel the country by myself, I don't, I mean, their progressiveness probably had a limit. They were first gen too, but I had a job, I was getting a master's. Like they still saw the security and how this could pivot, and so they just wanted me to be happy.
Mhm. So once you went down this path of education, how did that continue, or did it end at some point?
I would say it's evolved because I don't know if it's a full pivot every few years, but I think it's an evolution, right? Of something that I'm doing sort of blooms into the next piece. So I taught for 5 years at MS 137 in Ozone Park, Queens, and it was amazing. And still keep in touch with some of the teachers that are there. It was just a really great place to start your teaching career. Um, but when I had finished I think I had finished. I'd gone to Summer Principals Academy, which was just a great leadership training program. I met the founder of the charter school that I went to, and at the time I spoke to him, it was just the sixth grade, so I was going to come in as a seventh grade history teacher, and it just seemed like a great opportunity to see a different type of school before I assumed a full leadership role. It felt like if I've only been in one school in one setting, how can I really lead effectively if you haven't seen other models? So that was definitely a startup environment. I was the founding seventh grade history teacher and then looped with those kids until eighth grade. And then I started the first high school. So I was in a school specifically until around 2013. And then from there, uh, that pivoted into 1 year of supervising school leaders, which I didn't love. There are parts of it I loved, but what I really loved was really supporting leaders and building. And so I would say it was still in education, but I started our leadership training program internally. And then from there, the work just continued to evolve from leadership development to talent development to recruitment and then sort of HR proper. I'm really thinking about the whole employee experience from the time they look at your job description online to the time they say, this is no longer working for me, or I'm moving, or I decided to career change, or whatever those things are. So I was with that organization for 14 years, which was wonderful in so many ways, challenging, of course, during the pandemic. But it was time to move on. I was burnt out. I was feeling that I wasn't the best version of myself. And so have pivoted again and evolved again to essentially do the same work that I was doing, just for different clients. And so I've had the opportunity to work for schools, a behavioral health nonprofit, a few other organizations, do some leadership coaching, which has just been really fun to be able to see how you take these general principles of talent and then apply them in different contexts to make it work. So I still think I'm in education.
Yeah,
Just
I
other
would say
things
so.
too.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say so. The leadership jump, right, from being a teacher to leadership,
Mhm.
was there a track that the school system had for you to do that? And was it more of a volunteer basis, like a teacher just had to go, I'd like to do this, or
Yeah.
did you have to be selected based on performance or some
Yeah.
indicator that like how did that work?
Yeah. So I would say um, it's funny because then I completely shifted how things happened because I didn't think how I was selected was the most effective. So I, our founder knew that I wanted to be a school leader. And so early on in the as an eighth grade teacher, I put my hat in the ring for a high school director. And obviously, the smart move, right? To say, we need to do due diligence, we need to like do a search. I was like, absolutely. And so there wasn't a formal interview process, but I was an effective teacher. I was a grade level leader. So I had that leadership experience. I had my master's in ed leadership. And so that's how I was selected to do that. I think it was still a significant jump. We didn't have the supports that we have today in terms of building up folks so that they are ready. One, that they are ready for that principal seat, whether, you know, that was part of the work that I did, was creating this principal training program for folks that were great, right? And had what it took, but maybe they needed, I don't know, they needed to get better at math instruction, or they needed to be better at long-term planning or effective communication, right? Because there's so many different parts of being a leader. It's not enough, like in any career, right? The jump from individual contributor to leader is a very different, it's a totally different job. Even if you know how to do the work really well, it's totally a different thing to be a leader. And I honestly felt that struggle a lot in my first 2 years. I was fortunate to have an amazing coach in the middle of my second year. I was like, I need support. I need someone who's running alongside me to help me figure out how to, I know what it's supposed to look like and how do I get everyone there. And my coach, Eileen, who I joke, she can never quit me. It's like, what, like 14, 15 years later, I still call her when I have a problem. Her kids were like 7 at the time. They're now in college. Like, it's, you know, you can't quit me, Eileen. But I had that level of support. And then I had a boss that third year who, again, provided that level of coaching and support. And I felt the difference in myself, in the school, when I had that. And so we created that leadership training program, and just a more robust way to assess prospective school leaders. So it's not just, oh, well, you teach well, so you can lead. It's how are we actually assessing for different leadership skills. So I joke that the program I created was the program I wanted to have, and I wish I had, so that other people's paths to leadership didn't have to be as bumpy.
Would you say that your rise to like the high school principal position, it sounds fast, right? I feel like when I was in school, teachers didn't become a school principal so quickly.
Yeah.
So how did you get that opportunity? Was it sort of at the perfect timing of a new school that was being established? Uh, and how did you beat out the competition? Because I'm sure that there were lots of other, you know, people who were probably vying for the principal slot.
Well, it was a growing school. It was a small school. So I would say that especially in that time period of the 2010s, a lot of charter schools had a lot of young leaders. I think that has shifted definitely. And there's good things and bad things about it, right? I still had 7, 8 years of teaching experience under my belt before I had been a school leader. But charter schools, at least in New York, every state is different, doesn't have the same bureaucracy and requirements to be a leader in a lot of ways. Now, some of those things, looking back on it as a 43-year-old, right, having a C30 process where you have, in traditional public schools, where you have representatives from teachers to parents who are interviewing leadership candidates, like some of those things make sense. I also have seen really effective leaders who are young, who are 30, 31. And so I don't think that age is a requirement. However, you know, I think there's good and bad. I think anyone can be a great leader. I don't think there's one type of great leader. And I think charter schools, especially now, I think have broadened their definition of what great leadership can look like. So I don't think I was an anomaly. In the traditional public school system, I probably would still be at 29 being a principal. But I would say even the New York City traditional public school system has gotten more expansive, I think, in what leadership requirements can look like.
That's very interesting. Your I'm seeing this trend line from college activities
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, the high school principal, and even what you're doing now. There's a leadership component of in every aspect, right? You're always participating active, like different activist activities and different school organizations. What do you think? drives you to do that? Like, was leadership something that you've always valued? Like, you wanted that? Um,
I think it's less about, because if I think about the things that I've assumed leadership over, it's there's been a need, right? So it's about the problem to be solved rather than being the person in charge. Um, Obviously, sometimes it's a little easier to sort of coordinate. I think I'm naturally someone who, I mean, other than my apartment as I look at it, that I do not organize well, but everything else I like am effective at organizing. Um, because at the end of the day, I think impact matters. And so I think that one feeling drawn to see impact, especially when it comes to issues of, whether it's equity or education or um, any of the other causes that I work on, I think impact matters because we can talk about something all day long, but if it's not ultimately helping the people that we're trying to serve, then it's not really it's largely performative. And so I think those are the things that end up drawing me. I think once things are established and settled, I kind of am ready for the next thing. And in a growing organization, that's great because I could figure out leadership training and then take a step and have somebody handle that and perfect that while I thought about talent more broadly. Or then, taking a step even further and saying, okay, how does talent and recruitment work together? Like, not from the time that someone looks at a job description to the time they're in our schools, how does that process feel aligned? And so I think problem solving and impact are the two things that draw me more than leadership per se.
okay. Then, so from after you left the charter school system, what was next?
Yeah, so I took 2 months off, which was the first time since I was 13 that I had taken 2 months off. And I joked it was my eat, pray, love period. And just recharged a bit. Both of my sisters had just had babies, so I got to be with them on maternity leave and help out. So that was great. And then starting mid March, I started working as a consultant. And then a few months later, the founders of Ratio 21 approached me. They had found me on LinkedIn. We had some mutual friends. And they are, brilliant and have startup experience, but they don't have like K-12 school experience and working with teenagers experience. And this wasn't what I thought, again, not what I thought I was going to do. If you asked me in January of 2022, what I was going to do, not what I thought. But the opportunity was really interesting and exciting. Somewhat full circle, one of my former students is working with me now as a facilitator, which is really fun, for one of our second high school that got started. But yeah, it's been really fun figuring that piece out. But yeah, and so that's been the work for the last few months.
And what's that like now? The transition from being a school
Mm.
leader to now, a startup where it might be less formalized and you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what the product is, and then also your consulting business. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you transition from an established school to these two
Yeah.
different projects? Or,
Yeah. I am figuring that out still. I don't think I have for someone who really was really proud of her time management and organization skills. It's something that I'm definitely continuously tweaking and working on. Um, because I have another client that I just signed as well, where we're going to be doing a few searches and codifying some recruitment and talent acquisition processes. Um, I think first of all, I like it. I have to be honest. Even when things are a little bit stressful during the day, I love the fact that my brain is working in so many different ways and so many different capacities. It's hard to get bored. And I also think doing different, not tasks, but different workflows makes you inherently better at the other ones, right? Because I think I forget who said it, but creativity is just there's no original ideas, but creativity is taking an idea and just applying it to a different context. So I love doing different types of work because I think it makes me better ultimately. But I will say I am right now figuring out how I can start setting some boundaries over, okay, this is the day, this is, a ratio 21 day, or this is a ratio 21 morning. For now, I think it's a Saturday, Sunday activity to plan that out. But yeah, it's an evolving piece. I'm more than happy to hear from other entrepreneurs on how they balance their time.
Yeah, happy to talk about that with you outside of
Yes.
the podcast. The how did you translate your skill sets from the school environment to what you're doing now? Like what was it about the ratio 21 that saw,
Mhm.
how did they just find you on LinkedIn and decided to, was it just your K through 12 experience and realized that you were a consultant now? Um, like
So
how did that all play
yeah, so
out?
one of the founders, we had a mutual connection, and I didn't know Jackie well in college. We've since gotten a bit closer, but I guess Jackie was able to at least vouch for me, and so Amal reached out, and we just generally talked. And while I've done K-12 education, it has been in a startup environment, so I I am used to having to figure things out without a playbook. Um, I still think a playbook is necessary, and so like I'm pushing towards creating that playbook. But I can straddle both worlds, I think, to some degree, and so that was the work. And so the focus is very similar to yours, which is how do we get students? Well, first was how do we rethink high school, but obviously that's a huge thing to figure out. So we started with extracurricular activities, and our pre med boot camp has been really powerful. And so you were saying earlier, right, how figuring out the product and what evolves. What was resonating with students was just hearing lots of different doctors and different people in different parts of their careers, right? Someone who was doing their med school applications, and someone who's in med school, and someone who you know, was in practice or was a teacher now, and um, hearing all of their stories. Some of those, some people, they joked their first word out of their mouths was, I want to be a doctor. Whereas some people didn't know until, after college. And then some people knew they wanted to be a doctor, but didn't know what type of doctor. And so some of the feedback that we've gotten is, oh, there's not one way to do this. How awesome. Like, and you see the pressure coming off of them. Um, and going back to my own high school experience again, no one was there was a lot of pressure in the school, and of course I heaped enough on my own psyche as well. And so I love the fact that we're just kind of letting kids know that there's lots of different ways to do things, that you don't have to, yes, plot a direction, but you don't have to feel like that's you're committing to that at 17 or 18. And watching the sense of relief on their faces has been wonderful, and getting excited about, oh, like medical research can be cool, because I'm not just writing a report that my teacher gave me. I'm exploring something that I am actually passionate about. And so now we're trying to think through, okay, so how do we take this success and evolve it into other careers, interests, what have you, to figure out what that looks like. So that's where we're at right now. If you talk to me in 7 months, it could be something totally different. I don't know, but we'll see.
Are, just based on your experience, especially on ratio 21 and
Mm-hmm.
also your past experience, do you think that there's a lot of pressure on kids or the young adults in general to go figure out what you want to do with your life? Like, and how real is uh, that pressure?
I think so. When I think every person absorbs pressure differently, right? So whether the pressure exists or not is one thing, and then how students internalize that, there's so many different factors, right? What their parents and their family life is like, what their school is like, their connection to perfectionism. There's so many different pieces. But I will say that the college process and the business that has been created around it has also, I think, added fuel to the crazy. I think kids are under a lot more stress than I was. And I think we were pretty stressed in the 90s, especially in New York City. Um, and I'd even say sometimes for students that don't necessarily seem stressed out, I think there's For some of them, they're just shut down, right? It's like, I can't even deal with this, process this, or there's no way I can be successful at this. And so I'm just going to do this other path. So I also think pressure and stress manifest really differently in different ways. So it's a hard question to answer, but I would say that the voices seem louder now than they were in the 90s.
With your personal experience, have you
Mhm.
would you say that that pressure is realistic, that you know, having to pick a career path early on in your life and then sticking with it, is that realistic? um that that type of stress, like, hey, I have to decide, you know, when I'm young, uh, or else I might be behind in the future, right? I think that's why there's the stress.
And I think it's complicated, right? I think just like any other group, teenagers are not a monolith. And they, just like any other group, don't like being spoken to as though they are. I think it's a mix of things. I think some of it is a lack of education, right? And a lack of, and not education in terms of like, oh, my algebra class is not doing what it needs to, but just understanding, especially if you didn't grow up in a professional family, or if you are a first gen student, like there's just a disconnect. Like I was talking to a friend over dinner the other day about networking, and she was, she's first gen from a lower income family, and was really saying how she really struggles with just networking and asking people for help, which I definitely get. You don't necessarily know the rules, so there's that. So that's a trend for some people. Some people also are from that exact demographic and have no problem whatsoever to network. So I think there's some of that. I think it's students who have gotten A's sometimes, right? Like, oh, I do X and Y happens, like this sort of very cause and effect type thinking. Oh, I'm good at science. I like this. Therefore, I'm going to be a doctor. That's successful. So sometimes it's just uh, that level of perfectionism, or similar to me, right? There's this idea that you have when you're 10 or 11, and you just hang on to it, and like, this is what I'm going to be, and you feel a pressure to do it. I wonder, like, when I was growing up, when we were growing up, right, we didn't have all of these like 30 under 30 lists, things like that. I wonder how much that comes into it, right? You just see more people, and God bless, like, great. If you can be like a TikTok millionaire at 25, I want to learn from you. But I think it's also helpful to, and it's better obviously to think that that's possible than only thinking, oh, I can't even think about being a principal or this, that, or the other thing until I hit 40 or 50. Um, I think the push is like, how do we get like anything, how do we get the needle in the middle to say, if you know what you want to do and you want to do that, that's great. And here are the resources. And also, if you don't and you're not sure, that's also great. And also, if you do the thing that you think you want to do and you get to be 28 doing it and you're like, you want to pivot, that's okay too. Like, how do we just normalize like the choices? That would be the ideal.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for that insight. I just sort of took us on a little quick tangent there. So kind of going back to your career, how did you decide, you know, from education, the
Mhm.
consulting topic that you
Mhm.
have? Was it based on, you know, your personal, uh, you know, activist organizational interests, or
Mhm.
your skill sets? Like, what led you to your current
Yeah.
decision on doing that type of consulting?
And this is where I think it's an evolution, right? So I, as a school leader, had to learn a lot and about team building and culture and giving feedback and all of these very like HRE trends, which then have merged into leadership development program. Over time, because we had to not just work with our schools, but our back office, like our finance team, our HR team, our academics team, started to realize, my partner and I started to realize, oh, this is just good leadership and talent processes. This is on some level industry agnostic. I think the emotional pull to get it right feels different in education, because when you have good leadership and good talent processes, that ultimately means a teacher is better in a classroom for children, right? So there's a sort of this moral call to action. but the processes are all the same, or very similar. And working in this behavioral health organization just solidified that for me, and working in some other nonprofits. So I took we were taking what made a great classroom into a great school, and then taking that to say, how do you build that for the adults? How do you build a culture that people know what they're supposed to do, but they can collaborate, they don't feel alone, they can get better at things? Because when you tell good people, here's the thing you need to accomplish, here's the problem you need to figure out, and here are the ways to get better, then people do great things. And again, another quote I don't know how to attribute: culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? How do you build a culture around excellence so that you don't have to have these micromanaging processes that like everyone hates? And so that was the work that we ended up doing for the last few years. And that's industry agnostic. And so I love working with schools. I love being in schools. I definitely miss working with kids in a lot of ways. But helping organizations to build those systems that support those cultures of excellence and autonomy in service of the mission, I think, is the work. And that's why I said it's like it has felt less like a pivot and more like pulling a thread from each chapter and just drawing on that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I see the parallels.
Mhm.
How how did you meet the behavioral health
Yeah.
organization and also the nonprofits? Were you already previously involved with those organizations, or was that something that you had to seek out, or did they contact you? How did that, you know, relationship play out?
Yeah. So I have worked with, I've been on several boards over the past few years. And so the schools that I've worked with over the past year and a half have all been folks that I've worked with in the past in one way, shape, or form. Either I've gone to grad school with them or college. And so needing some work there. With the behavioral health organization, I'm actually subcontracting with a woman I met through Chief, which is a women's networking organization I'm a part of. And so it worked out really well for both of us because she didn't have a strong, at the time, uh, subject matter experts who dealt with people and culture. And I hadn't had experience in behavioral health. So it was kind of a great way to partner. And they are a great organization. They've been very mission driven, very much committed to the work that they do, very committed to getting better. And it's the expression they want to get it right, but they don't have to be right. And the leadership team really lives that, and so they've been really a joy to work with.
So the networking, and actually, how did you get on the boards? Like, what was it because you were a school principal that you were sort of
Mhm.
pulled and selected because they needed someone in the education space, or how did you, or did you seek these positions out? Like, what, how do you even get a board role, I guess?
Yeah, so it's been, and some of my board work is coming to an end or will be coming to an end. But the first the first one it's a standalone charter school, middle school, and the charter accelerator that our school had been founded through, my school had been founded through, was the one that Graham was going through. And so they connected us because he needed somebody with more school experience and academic experience. And so I was the board chair for the last 5 years and just rolled off because it's time. so so that's how that happened. With Gilda's Club, I'm on the Red Door Community now. So on the associate board. So my mom passed in 2017, at the beginning of the 2017 of cancer. And so they provide support, therapy, groups, what have you, to not just the people who have cancer, but their families. And that level of wraparound services that are free just felt really powerful, and so wanted to get involved. So I've been involved in that associate board since 2017. I've worked with Felt. That was more of an application. So the last three were all someone put out a call. I said, I would love to do this. And given the work that I had done both at my organization and then at my other board position, was ultimately they needed folks to do things like marketing or, strategic planning or, just solidifying operations and systems. So because I've been able to wear a lot of hats, I think when you're on a startup and I would say most of the boards, not associate boards, but the boards that I've worked on have either been uh, startup slash like working boards where you're essentially supporting because they can't afford like a chief people officer or so they need somebody with that level of expertise to be able to support. But there's lots of different types of boards that you can get involved with, especially on the nonprofit side.
Okay, yeah. So you sort of raised your hand and volunteered for organizations that you were interested in, and you mentioned a little bit about like Chief, the organization. It seems like a really great network. Are there any other ways of networking? And then maybe talk a little bit about how Chief
Mhm.
operates too.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways, and whether it's a conference that you can go to, or there's a number of, I feel like there's more and more organizations that are centered around this idea of creating community in order to support. Next week, I'm talking to Her Workplace, which is a organization designed to help junior and mid-level career women mostly in traditional male dominated fields. And so I'm going to talk to them about owning your professional growth. So there's organizations like Her Workplace that are starting to say, hey, this group, this demographic doesn't have a community yet. And I think that was starting before, but probably accelerated by the pandemic. Um, uh, Someone that I worked with many years ago, I'm not sure where he's at right now, was creating one for educators. So I think it's a matter of looking at, depending on your industry. So if you're working, I would say look at industries that have industry specific associations, right? Like HR has SHRM. There's, ones for nonprofit work. There's ones for fundraising and development, and I think the biggest advice I would give is don't just go to the session and sit there and take notes and leave, right? That's not, that's not what's necessarily going to differentiate you. Same thing is true for school and for educational programs, right? The leadership program that I went to at Teachers College, there was the program and it was great, don't get me wrong, but the real curriculum was in working with people who were doing school leadership in different spaces and learning from them and then keeping in touch with them, and meeting up every once in a while to say, how are you solving this problem? Like that's the mindset I think to approach. I think you can always be networking. And I think and then I would say there's also probably organizations in your city and community where it's just geared towards like young professionals, right? And it might be industry agnostic, but it's more about getting a group of folks together. But look, you never know I would advise not to do it transactionally. You just never know where someone is going to support you. And just get to know people and learn their stories. You'll always walk away. Worst case scenario, you walk away with a great conversation, but most of the time you walk away learning something about, how they approached a problem and you think differently about the work, or they can connect you with somebody else. But, you got to play the long game too.
Could you talk a little bit about that transactional piece that you just mentioned?
Yeah.
Because I think some people might actually think of like, well, networking in general, it feels transactional. So
Yep.
can you detail a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah. And my early models for this felt very used car salesman-y. So I at first thought I was horrible at networking when I realized networking is just getting to know people, right? Then it's like, oh, okay, I can do that. Like that sounds great. Helping people, getting to talk to them, getting to know their stories. I think approaching it less as oh, I need to make this sale or I need to get this thing. Like I wouldn't approach it that way. It also just feels icky. I don't know. Maybe some people like that. I'm definitely not one of them. But if you approach it as oh, how cool is it that I get to like learn about this person? And I would also say like I know people find it hard to believe, but as an introvert, I actually much more appreciate one-to-one interaction rather than large group unstructured settings. Getting to know people's story, what makes them tick, like how they got, essentially the questions you're asking me, right? The questions you ask other people, to get to know. And then sometimes there's an opportunity to collaborate. or problem solve together. Sometimes it's just oh, okay, like you're a cool person to know. And so I know when I meet someone that has that problem you're trying to solve, I'm gonna connect you. Or it's just a good conversation. And that's great. Like now you know somebody you didn't know before. Um, I think if you approach the work with curiosity, I think it's more fun that way too.
Do you have a way in which you maintain these relationships? Because a lot of these,
Yeah.
uh, even the opportunities that you were talking about
Mhm.
with the startup, that was through an old college connection, right? That
Yeah.
you didn't even necessarily stay too much in touch with. Like, how do you think that it was a great, or what are your recommendations in terms of like
Yeah.
maintenance of a network?
So I think there's a few things that help. I appreciate that social media can be a dirty word for a lot of folks, but I also think it's a great, if used correctly, it's a great way to stay connected with folks and give people a chance to get to know who you are. Obviously, there's the evil genius side of that where like everything is so curated, but um, I think whether it's LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook, there's different ways that people interact with me. Obviously, friends and family and work, folks in the orbit that I've known for a while are more on Facebook and Instagram. LinkedIn is obviously more professional, but I think you can still show people who you are and what you care about. And so I think that's a passive way to do it. That's just helpful. Again, for someone who needs to recharge their battery every once in a while, I think that's important. Um, there's and then there's the cultivating piece, which is yes, it's interacting on social media, or it's just saying like I haven't talked to this person in a while. I also think that's just true of getting older and being having friends is to say like if you don't work at your relationships as you get older, like we're not, I don't know, it's easier when you're in your 20s and everyone's like, yeah, let's hang out on this day, and you realize like I'm talking to a friend and we've got a dinner date planned 3 weeks out because that's how we're gonna find, that's how we're gonna see each other. And so I do the same thing with some professional connections that I'm friendly with, to say, hey, we haven't chatted in a while, do you want to grab a drink, do you want to grab a coffee? um, some people, I'm not organized yet to have like, some people have like a spreadsheet where they say, oh, this is the last time that I talked to this person. I'm not that organized yet. I aspire to be. But it's more of a feeling of like, oh, I haven't talked to this person in a while and I want to. It's fortunate that the business connections that I have in that space are people actually like I want to grab a drink with. So it's definitely easier for that reason. But um, yeah, I think those are my general. I don't know if that's the answer, but those are my answers.
Makes sense to me. I think those are effective. I don't want to say tasks because that sounds
Yeah.
transactional, but seems like good techniques. Maybe that still sounds transactional as well. I'll find the word maybe later.
Well,
The
sometimes you have to take some transactional steps to get like just to break it down. Otherwise, because building relationships is a huge piece, right? But sometimes, it's even saying, hey, so and so started a new job 6 months ago. I'd love to like, let me ask how it's going. So there is a strategic part of like scheduling time in your calendar to say, let me go through and see who I haven't. So that part is, I think, tactical, but without that, you're never going to get to the fun stuff.
Got it. Yeah, that's a really good explanation, actually. Um, Great. So if there's someone out there who's interested in going down the path of education,
Mm-hmm.
uh, what recommendations do you have for them? And we can probably talk about a student who's interested in doing it, and maybe even a mid-career transition person,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that's possible as well. Could you kind of
Yeah.
speak to both?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the challenges with education, in talking to people, whether it's policy or about the work, is we've all gone to school. And so there can be a tendency to sometimes, and I am guilty of this, is like, oh, this is my experience, so this is the experience. So one thing I would say is just get to know different types of schools. Because like a Montessori school and even when you say charter or traditional public or private, which is often used to divide the three, I would say the diversity within those schools are so different. Um, And I think just getting to know different types of schools to understand first what are the things that are drawing you to education. Um, I think that's important. I think getting to know your why about education is really important. And it looks a little bit different in different levels. I'll just speak for high school. What I always noticed when I interviewed high school teachers is there's two camps. There's the I care about, and obviously there's a mix, obviously, but people fall a little bit more on one than the other. Is I love kids. I want to be there for kids. Um, and I want to like help shape their experience either because I didn't have a great one or I had a great one and I want them to have that. So there's the I'm focused on the kid. Then there's the ones that are still focused on the kid, but they love their content, right? They're just like, oh my God, I love English. I love history. And I want others to love it as much as I do. And it's a subtle difference, but it's important to know. So I think asking yourself why I think is important because you're going to have to get better at the other thing. And that's important. Know your content really well, but also know that you're teaching kids to understand the content. You're not teaching the content itself. I would say one of the most impactful books that I read when I started teaching was not a traditional education book, but it was a neuroscience book about how the brain worked and learned. And I'll shout him out here, Dan Willingham. He is a professor at UVA. He was giving this talk to teachers thinking, oh, of course teachers know this, and they didn't. So he's written books on how do we learn? Which I think was one of the most pivotal books that I read because once it was like, oh, now I can understand how learning takes place and how you craft activity after activity so that someone walks away understanding was just like mind blowing. So I would say definitely think about neuroscience and psychology in addition to your content, in addition to learning kids. So those are just some ideas, but like get into schools. Just get into, if you can get into schools and volunteer and see how different people try to solve the problems in education today, I think people will figure out their paths.
Is it difficult to get the certifications to become a teacher?
I'm laughing only because it is a hotly debated topic. It depends on the state. Is the quick answer. You know, there are states like New Jersey and Connecticut that it is much more difficult to obtain that certification. In some states, much easier to. So, and I don't always know if a state, I'll speak broadly and therefore not offend anyone, hopefully, but I'm okay with that. I don't know if all state certifications requirements necessarily translate to effective teaching. There's also a lot of argument, rightfully, that the some of the certification requirements in certain states also make sure that limit the ability to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive in a lot of ways. And so I think they're not always focused on the right things.
Got it. So basically, it really depends on the state that you're in regarding
It depends
the
on the state.
difficulty and
Yep,
challenge.
totally. And with talent shortages being where there are, I would say even some of the stricter states right now probably do have emergency certification pathways. I guess all I'll say is, you know, the challenge is that we obviously everyone wants the best teachers in front of children, right? And teachers who care about them, care about content, care about you know, really creating a culture where kids feel supported, right? I think we all want that, regardless of where we sit on the aisle. How we get there and the types of requirements are challenging, right? So I think I started this work at 24 thinking, of course, certification is the answer. But me sitting in a grad school class writing papers on adolescent psychology is very different than me working with a 14-year-old who in real time is like being a 14-year-old and pushing back in the way that 14-year-olds do. And so it's just a challenge overall. And I think also teaching is something you always have room to improve on.
Yeah, that it's super interesting. Like when I think everyone has an opinion. You originally said this. I think everyone has an opinion on education, and we all think that we know what it is because we've been on the receiving end of it. But to hear the multiple fact or the myriad of factors that kind of are part of this education space, it sounds so complex. And you know, do you think? And I hear this all the time about like pay in education is just too low, and I think so
Mhm.
too. Um, what would you say to that of someone who's going into this profession and then
Mhm.
hearing it constantly that that you just don't get paid enough? Like, of course, there's going to be shortages. Like, what is the motivation then for
Yeah.
edu- people to go into the education space? Like, how
Yeah.
do you
So
kind of overcome that?
yeah, so I would say pay is definitely an issue, especially in certain states over others, right? I think um, there are states like California and Oklahoma that are just known for lower teacher pay, and they really struggle. Um, Not to say, and New York, yes, on face you can say, oh, a teacher can make up to this money, but the cost of living obviously is a whole different beast in New York. I think though, I it's a hard question to ask because I think we do have to put pressure on, and it's not even the school's fault, right? Like they get budgets, so it's not. I don't want to blame school systems necessarily, though allocation of always is something. And schools are, I think, every school district and charter school system that I know that has the ability to change salary is changing salary. So like no one's sleeping at the wheel here. But to go back to your question, I think I would say that teaching is one of the most creative jobs that you can have. Um, you could teach a lesson first period and then teach the same lesson third period, and it will go totally different. um, and so, this ability to say, how do I get this content? How do I get these kids, the kids in front of me, my kids, to understand this content and not just understand it, but like really get excited about it and get immersed in that work. I mean, there's nothing better, right? There's nothing better when Boss Tweed becomes like the joke of the group because you've just gotten the kids to like really be fascinated by political machines. So there's something really wonderful about creating that culture. Um, I, obviously would love people to stay in education, but the people who are pivoting educators, like, gotta tell recruiters, like, if you're not looking at transitioning teachers, you are sleeping at the wheel in terms of talent. These are people who, like, know how to think on the fly, plan with, like, do less with more consistently, are incredibly creative, have to be data informed, know how to build relationships. Like if you have a good teacher, they are good at so many different types of skill sets that yeah, you should just these are folks that should be sort of scooped up in any sort of capacity if you need it. And that's really amazing, right? There aren't too many other careers where you can really have that level of creativity and also have impact on actual lives. That's also super stressful. Because you're like, okay, well, to my point of like, yeah, I can get the lesson right by seventh period, but that's an hour of a kid's life that I might have wasted if I didn't plan effectively. So there's always that impetus to plan as effectively as possible while also giving yourself and the kids grace too. But I miss the classroom. Like if I didn't think that I would drive a principal crazy, I would apply for a teaching position now, but I don't know if it would be the best use of everyone's time. But I definitely miss it all the time.
Before we close this out, do you have any other advice that we haven't talked about that you would like to impart to the audience? It could be life or career in general. Really, you have the floor.
Okay. Okay. A lot of pressure. I think it's, you know, because the audience here is folks in high school and college and early 20s, right? I think, you know, whatever task you have in front of you, whatever job you have to do, like do it well, right? Do it well, do it conscientiously, but also know that this isn't going to be the only thing you do. And so think about, I would just say it really embrace learning. And there's so many types, even when you don't have the ability to, go to a conference or what have you, like look around your workplace. Like, who's there that's awesome at something that you can learn from them? Or is there a stretch opportunity or a committee you can join? And you may not know where it lands, but that's great. I had no idea when I started talent development that I would get so interested in marketing and storytelling and communications, but that was a thing that started to happen. And I think letting that letting your interests and letting your curiosity lead you down different paths is a good thing. Don't be siloed. Protect yourself, set boundaries so that you, can be sane, of course, 100%. But also, I think staying curious is incredibly important, because you never know where a skill or a connection or an experience is going to serve you later, even if it's not a direct line. So that would be my biggest piece of advice.
Great. So, if anyone has any questions for you, Lisa, how could they reach you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is just to find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me. If you send me an invite request, just tell me like where you heard me, so I know who you are. But yeah, definitely send an email that way, and I'm happy to answer any questions there.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and providing your insight, Lisa. It's been great, like hearing all the different from tactical stuff about networking all the way to how you got into education and then into consulting, and even just learning about the education space. It's been really helpful and informative. So thank you so much for joining us at the Life of a Career podcast, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks for joining us at Mentor Access. If you like what you just watched, please click like and subscribe, and also hit that bell so that you get notified when we have new videos come out. Thank you for supporting our mission.